The chains hit the stone floor before she did. That sound, metal on frozen ground, sharp and ugly and deliberate, cut through the winter air like a sentence no one in that courtyard was ready to finish. And every wolf standing in that snow-dusted yard turned to look. Not at the chains, at the girl attached to them. She was still standing. That was the first thing that knocked the breath out of the crowd. Because nobody stood after being dragged through 3 miles of mountain road in a winter storm. Nobody stood with their wrists raw and their dress half ruined at the shoulder and the cold eating into them like that. Nobody stood in the middle of an entire pack of wolves surrounded by the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories and every soldier who answered to him, and looked completely, quietly unbothered. But she did. Her name was Seraphina Vale, 22 years old, auburn hair, dark eyes, cheekbones you could cut glass on. And the look on her face as she lifted her chin and took in that courtyard, she didn't look like a girl being delivered as punishment. She looked like a woman who had already decided this was just the next thing she was going to survive. That distinction mattered. It mattered more than anyone in that courtyard understood yet. The storm had been building since nightfall, the kind of northern winter storm that comes in low and mean, pressing everything flat. The courtyard of the Morell estate sat at the edge of the mountain village of Ashcroft, and by the time the Alpha King's party arrived, ice crystals were riding sideways in the wind, and the torches were fighting to stay lit. The villagers had come out anyway. Of course they had. When Alpha King Cale Dravith rides into your town, you come out. You stand in the cold. You watch. Because missing it feels like missing something you will never be able to explain to your children. He arrived on a black horse that moved, like it understood it was carrying something significant. And Cale Dravith. Let me tell you about Cale Dravith, because the word feared doesn't quite cover it. Feared is what you call a man who makes people nervous. Cale Dravith was the kind of alpha who made entire governments nervous, who had walked into war councils and ended conflicts not by sitting down and talking, but by simply standing in the room until everyone else remembered they didn't want to find out what happened if he stopped being patient. He was 31 years old and had been the ruling alpha of the Northern Territories since he was 24, when he took the title the way lightning takes a tree, fast, total, and permanent. Nobody challenged him anymore. Not because they lacked the ambition, because they valued their continued existence. He was tall, dark-haired, the kind of face that looked like it had been designed to make people uncomfortable, all sharp jaw and cold eyes and zero interest in making you
feel at ease. He wore black riding leathers still damp at the shoulders from the border run, a cloak that moved behind him like it was alive, and an expression that hadn't changed since he arrived, which was the expression of a man doing a task he considered beneath his time. Until he saw her. Until he looked at the girl in chains, standing in the middle of his courtyard, spine straight, chin up, looking at him the way you look at a thunderstorm you're deciding whether or not to walk into, and something in his face did something no one standing in that courtyard had ever seen it do. It stopped. Not softened, not warmed. It stopped, like a machine that just detected input it wasn't built to process. Lady Helena Morell stepped forward through the crowd with the smooth, satisfied movement of a woman who had been rehearsing this exact moment for a long time. She was elegant in the way expensive things are elegant. Polished surfaces, calculated angles, beauty deployed as a weapon. She wore a fur-trimmed coat and a smile that didn't reach anything above her mouth. "My lord?" Her voice carried over the wind like she'd practiced that too. As agreed, in settlement of the Morell family's outstanding debt to the crown, I offer you this girl, She is strong, she is quiet, and she is entirely without family claim. Do with her as you see fit." The crowd absorbed this. Serafina didn't move, didn't look at Helena, didn't look at the crowd. She looked at Kyle. Directly, steadily. The way you look at someone when you're deciding whether to be afraid of them and concluding, with conscious deliberateness, that you're not. And Kale looked back at her. Not at Helena, not at the assembled wolves, not at the political theater happening around him. At her, his eyes moved over her the way a man reads something he needs to fully understand. Not quickly, not dismissively. Slow, careful. He took in the bruise at her collarbone, old and layered, the color of a sky before a bad storm. He took in her hands, fingers laced together in front of her to stop the shaking she wasn't going to show. He took in the torn shoulder of her dress, and the fact that underneath the cold and the exhaustion and the chains, she was holding herself with a dignity that Helena Morel, in all her expensive fur and calculated smiles, could not produce. Something moved behind his eyes, something old, something his wolf understood faster than his human mind was willing to admit. A guard to his left, one of his own men, trying to be efficient, reached out and grabbed Serafina's arm to move her forward. What happened next took less than 2 seconds and changed the entire temperature of the night. Kyle's hand shot out and locked around the guard's wrist. The sound it made was quiet, controlled. The guard went white and then gray and then dropped to one knee. "Don't." That was all Kyle said. One word, spoken at the volume of a conversation, carrying the weight of an avalanche. Nobody moved. Serafina looked at the guard on the ground, looked at Kyle's hand, now lowered back to his side, looked at his face. He was looking at her. And she didn't say thank you. She didn't look relieved. She looked at him with those dark eyes and that impossible composure, and she thought something he couldn't hear but could somehow feel. And whatever it was, it landed behind his sternum and stayed there. Helena Morel was already explaining something about the debt terms and the transfer of responsibility. Nobody was listening to her anymore. Hi, viewers. I have a very personal question for you right now. If you were Serafina in that moment, standing in chains in the cold, given away by the woman who was supposed to protect you, what would be the very first thing running through your mind? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Because here's what was running through Serafina's mind. Not fear, not anger, not even grief, though the grief was there, deep and old and layered the same way those bruises were layered, the kind that comes from years of accumulation rather than a single event. What she was thinking was this: 22 years. I gave that house 22 years of my hands and my back, and my silence and my endurance. 22 winters. 22 summers. I made their bread, and mended their clothes, and carried their water, and took their blame, and I never once asked for anything back. Not kindness, not belonging, just to be left alone in peace. And this is what it was worth. This. Standing in someone else's courtyard in chains, while Helena Morel smiled her thin, satisfied smile and called her disposable. Disposable. She let that word move through her. She didn't fight it. She didn't collapse under it. She just felt it, all the way down to the cold stone under her feet. And then she made a decision so quiet and so total that it didn't even feel like a decision. It felt like a door closing. She was done. Done grieving what she'd never actually... Done performing the role of the girl who might someday be chosen. Done waiting for Helena Morel or anyone else to see her clearly. She was 22 years old, and she had nothing, and she was standing in a stranger's courtyard in a winter storm, and somewhere behind her, the woman who raised her was wrapping up a business transaction. And the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories was still looking at her. Not past her, not through her. At her, like she was something he was trying to solve. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked away first. Not because she was afraid, but because she was tired and cold, and her hands were shaking, and she had already given this night more than it deserved. Cale watched her look away. His jaw shifted once. He turned to his war captain, Aldrich, a broad, scarred man who had served him for 8 years and prided himself on being able to read any situation. And he said very quietly, "Get the chains off her, now." Aldrich moved. Helena Morell opened her mouth to say something about protocol and the terms of transfer. "Helena." Kyle didn't look at her. "We're done here." The finality in those 4 words made Helena's mouth close with an audible click. Her smile didn't waver. She was too practiced for that. But something in her eyes flickered. Something that looked, just briefly, like the first edge of uncertainty. The chains came off Serafina's wrists. She didn't rub them, didn't examine the marks. She pressed her fingers together once, hard, and straightened her spine another fraction of an inch, and waited. A soldier brought a riding cloak, heavy wool, dark blue, and held it out toward her with the careful body language of someone who had just watched a man break another man's wrist for touching her. She took the cloak, put it on, pulled it closed. And when Kyle's horse was brought forward and his war captain moved to help Serafina mount the second horse, Kyle, without explaining himself to anyone, without any ceremony, moved his horse between Serafina and the crowd. A wall between her and everything watching. He didn't look at her when he did it. He didn't have to. The ride to Castle Blackthorn would take 4 hours through the mountain pass in a winter storm. 4 hours in the dark, in the cold, with the most feared wolf in the north, riding close enough that she could hear his horse breathing. 4 hours to figure out what came next. She pulled the borrowed cloak tighter and rode forward into the dark. Behind her, Helena Morell stood in the snow and watched them go. And for the first time in the 22 years she had kept Serafina Vale, she looked at the girls retreating back and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not guilt. Helena Morell had surgically removed that particular capacity years ago. Something closer to miscalculation. Like she had just handed a loaded weapon to the wrong person, and the full weight of that decision hadn't finished arriving yet. She would understand it completely. Very soon. But by then, it would be far too late. He hadn't spoken a word to her in 40 minutes when he finally did. The carriage was warm, warmer than anywhere she had slept in years, and the storm was pressing against the windows like it had an opinion about where they were going. Mountains rose on either side of the pass, black against the dark sky, and the torchlight from the lead riders turned the snow ahead of them amber and gold. Inside, the silence between them had mass. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. That was the strange part. It was the silence of 2 people who were both paying very close attention and doing their level best, not to show it. Serafina sat pressed against the far window, legs angled away from the center of the carriage, the borrowed cloak still wrapped around her shoulders. The chains were gone. The cold was fading. What was left was the particular hollowed-out exhaustion of a body that had been running on nothing but adrenaline for too long, and the very deliberate effort of her mind to take stock. She was in the Alpha King's carriage. The Alpha King had dismissed his guard captain from this carriage before they left the courtyard. There was no escort inside. Just him. Just her. And the dark and the storm and 45 minutes still to go. She wasn't afraid. That was the honest truth. She had already run the risk calculation and arrived at the conclusion that whatever came next was still better than what she had left. That was not a reassuring conclusion. It was just an accurate one. She was watching the mountains when he spoke. Your wrist. His voice at low volume was a different instrument than his voice in a courtyard full of people. It was quieter, rougher around the edges, like something that hadn't been asked to perform. She looked at him. He was looking at her left wrist, which was resting in her lap, where the sleeve of the cloak had slipped back. The bruise there was old, weeks old, yellow at the outer edge, a deep violet at the center, the kind of bruise that comes from a grip applied with real intent on multiple occasions. The kind of bruise that tells a whole story in about 5 seconds to anyone willing to read it. He was reading it. They're old, she said. Clean, no performance around it. I know. His jaw was tight. How many? She looked at him without blinking. More than that one. A muscle moved in the side of his face, his hand resting on his knee, curled once and then deliberately flattened. She did that, he said. Not a question. Her staff, Serafina said, occasionally her eldest son. Helena herself preferred other methods. The carriage hit a rough patch of road and swayed. Neither of them moved to brace. Why didn't you leave? He asked. She looked at him for a moment, and the look on her face was the particular expression of someone being asked a question by a person who has never had to answer it themselves. Where? She said. One word, no bitterness in it, just the flat geography of a life that had no exit. He didn't answer. She watched him absorb the answer she'd given, watched it land somewhere behind his eyes and settle there, joining the bruise and the spine and the courtyard and the chains and whatever calculation he was running about her. You're not afraid of me, he said. Should I be? Most people are. Most people haven't spent 22 years afraid of everything else. She turned back to the window. You reset the threshold. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Denser, more intentional. She felt him shift on the bench across from her, not toward her, just a realignment, the body language of someone settling into a different kind of attention. You spoke in the courtyard, he said, to the guard. The guard was hurting me unnecessarily. You told him so. Yes. Nobody told him anything. My own men were standing there. Your men were reading your reaction, she said. I wasn't interested in your reaction. I was interested in stopping him. Another pause. And when I stopped him, he said, watching her, that was your decision, she said. Not mine. She felt the full weight of his attention at that, not threatening, not offended, something that, on a different face, might have been amusement. You're not going to thank me, he said. I didn't ask you to do it? No, he said. You didn't. The way he said it, she caught something in his tone she hadn't expected. Not irritation, not ego. Something that sounded almost like respect. Quietly given, quickly recovered, but real. She didn't acknowledge it. She looked out the window. He slid his hand into the carriage door compartment beside him and drew out a heavy wool blanket. Not with any ceremony, not with any explanation. He set it on the seat beside her without a word. She looked at it, looked at him. He was watching the road out his own window. She picked up the blanket and pulled it across her lap. Her hands had stopped shaking a few miles back, but the cold was still in her bones, the way cold gets in when you've been in it long enough. Settled deep below the surface, the kind that takes hours of real warmth to undo. She didn't say thank you. He didn't require it. Outside, the storm was picking up. The torches up ahead guttered and recovered. The mountain pass was narrowing, and the sounds of the horses were muffled by the weight of the snowfall, and the whole world outside the carriage windows had contracted to this. Black rock and white snow and orange torchlight and the road ahead. Serafina let her head rest back against the carriage wall. She wasn't soft, she wasn't relaxing, she was conserving. But the warmth of the blanket was real. The absence of chains was real. And across from her, the most feared alpha in the north was riding in silence and not demanding anything from her, which was, against every expectation she'd built in that courtyard, the single most disorienting thing that had happened to her all night. She stored that detail, filed it carefully. She had survived 22 years by being the most observant person in any room she occupied. That skill didn't turn off just because the room had changed. The carriage rolled forward through the dark. And Kyle Draveth, who had not looked away from the road, reached up once and adjusted the small window vent at his side, redirecting the warmth from the carriage heater toward her side of the cabin. Not looking at her when he did it. Not waiting to see if she noticed. She noticed. She pulled the blanket a little tighter. And somewhere in the dark mountain pass, between the life she'd left and the one she hadn't yet seen, something small and fragile and extremely dangerous began to breathe. The carriage rolled on. She didn't sleep, but for the first time in 22 years, she wasn't alone in the dark. And she didn't know yet whether that was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her, all night. She stored that detail, filed it carefully. She had survived 22 years by being the most observant person in any room she occupied. That skill didn't turn off just because the room had changed. The carriage rolled forward through the dark. And Kyle Draveth, who had not looked away from the road, reached up once and adjusted the small window vent at his side, redirecting the warmth from the carriage heater toward her side of the cabin. Not looking at her when he did it. Not waiting to see if she noticed. She noticed. She pulled the blanket a little tighter. And somewhere in the dark mountain pass, between the life she'd left and the one she hadn't yet seen, something small and fragile and extremely dangerous began to breathe. The carriage rolled on. She didn't sleep, but for the first time in 22 years, she wasn't alone in the dark. And she didn't know yet whether that was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her or the beginning of the only thing that ever actually mattered. She would find out. Soon, Castle Blackthorn announced itself through the floor. Not a sound, a vibration. Something deep in the earth, rising through the carriage wheels and the wooden boards and into the soles of her feet. And Serafina sat forward off the carriage wall with her eyes sharp before she even understood why. Then she looked out the window. The forest broke apart, and the castle was just there, like it had always been there. Like the mountain itself had grown tired one winter centuries ago and decided to become architecture instead. Black granite towers rose against a sky that was barely lighter than they were. Ramparts carved with wolf imagery, worn smooth by weather and time. Torchlight burning in every slit window, all the way up to the main keep. The gates were enormous, iron and stone, open wide, with wolves carved into every surface in various postures of speed and violence, and something that might have been worship if you looked long enough. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she had ever seen. She didn't let that show on her face. The carriage rolled through the gates and into a stone courtyard the size of a small village square. Torches everywhere, wolves everywhere, soldiers, staff, attendants, a cluster of high-ranking pack members near the main entrance who had clearly been waiting for some time and were now doing the thing the entire pack was doing, which was trying to look like they weren't staring at her. Serafina stepped down from the carriage before any inside without explanation or ceremony, the way a man moves through rooms that belong to him, through the main entrance and into a corridor of dark stone and high ceilings, torchlight bouncing off carved walls, the sounds of the castle alive around them, distant voices, fire, the low, ambient hum of a place built to hold hundreds of wolves and currently doing exactly that. He walked her through 3 corridors and up a set of wide stone stairs. Stopped in front of a door. Opened it. The room inside was warm. That was the first thing. The fire was already going. Someone had prepared it in advance, which meant someone knew she was coming, which meant arrangements had been made before tonight that she hadn't been told about. The room was large, with a high ceiling and a wide window overlooking the inner courtyard. Heavy curtains in dark green, pulled back to show the snow still falling outside. There was a proper bed with actual linens, a writing desk, a wardrobe already stocked. She could see the edge of fabric from where she stood. A copper tub behind a screen in the corner with steam rising faintly. She stood in the doorway and took it in. "This is yours," Kyle said from behind her. "The room beside this one is mine. You'll have access to the full east wing. You won't be restricted in your movement." She turned to look at him. "Why?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because you're not a prisoner. Helena called me a gift. Helena is not here." 3 words. The simplest possible dismissal of everything that had happened tonight. And somehow, in his voice, at that volume, they landed with the weight of something final. She turned back to the room. The fire crackled. The snow fell outside. The castle breathed around them, deep and ancient and full of wolves. She hadn't met yet in corridors she hadn't learned yet, in a world that was entirely alien to everything she had ever known. A knock came at the door below. A kitchen attendant arrived with a covered tray. Bread, roasted meat, dried fruit, something hot in a clay cup. She set it on the table without meeting Serafina's eyes and withdrew. Kyle stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and watched while Serafina ate. Not hovering, not performing concern, just present, cataloging. The way he'd been cataloging her since the moment she stepped out of the chain in that courtyard, with the focused attention of someone who has found something worth understanding and intends to do so thoroughly. She noticed. She let herself eat first. After a while, she said, without looking up, "You're going to do that a lot, aren't you?" "Do what?" "Watch me." A pause. "Yes." "Is that optional?" "No." She picked up the clay cup. Whatever was inside was hot and spiced and deeply, aggressively warming, and she wrapped both hands around it and let the heat work into her palms. "Fine," she said. "But if you're going to watch, at least be honest about it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am being honest about it." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. He looked back. No performance on his end. No pretense. Just the same flat, direct, absolutely unmanageable attention he had been directing at her since the courtyard. Like she was a fact. He was in the morning. Nobody would call it debt repayment. It was just hers. She didn't understand yet why he'd given it to her. She didn't understand yet what it meant that he had dismissed his guards, adjusted her air vent, watched her with that impossible attention, stopped his war captain for an hour, said her name without knowing it. She didn't understand any of it yet, but tomorrow morning she would wake up in Castle Blackthorn. And the morning after that, and the next. And at some point, in some corridor or council room or quiet stretch of winter light, the Alpha King who had been watching her since the moment she arrived was going to stop watching. And start something else entirely. She pressed her hand flat against the door 1 moment longer. Then she walked to the bed, sat down on the edge, and stared at the fire. The question forming in her mind was quiet and specific and had absolutely no safe answer. Why does a man like that make every room feel smaller? And somehow, at the same time, make her feel like she finally has enough space to breathe. She didn't sleep for a long time, but when she did, she didn't dream of chains. Chapter 4. She calls me out in front of my entire war council on the 4th morning. Not loudly, not dramatically. She doesn't raise her voice or slam her hand on the table or perform anything. She just speaks, clear, level, direct. And the entire room stops breathing at once, because nobody speaks in my council chambers without being addressed first. Not my generals, not my border commanders, not the men who have fought wars at my side for a decade. But she doesn't know that rule yet. Or maybe she does, and she doesn't care. I'm still deciding which one it is. Lord Casson is mid-sentence when it happens. He's recommending we abandon 3 northern villages to the approaching raider forces. Strategic sacrifice, he calls it, pulling the words out with the smooth confidence of a man who makes this kind of decision often and sleeps fine afterward. The villages are small. The terrain is a liability. The people can be resettled. He has numbers to support every point, and he delivers all of it without once looking like a human being. I have been listening to Casson make this exact argument in different forms for 3 years. I have disagreed with him each time and overruled him each time, and he has restructured the argument each time with different numbers and the same core indifference. It is the most tedious cycle in my political life. And then Serafina says, from the far end of the table, "That's wrong." 2 words. The room goes so quiet I can hear the fire. Every head turns. Casson's face moves through surprise into offense so fast it's almost impressive. He lands on the particular expression of a powerful man who has just been contradicted by someone he has categorized as irrelevant and is now recategorizing them as a problem. I don't move. I am aware, acutely, specifically aware, of every molecule of air in my own body and the effort it is taking to keep my face from doing the thing it wants to do right now, which is not smile, exactly, but something in that direction that I have absolutely no business producing in the middle of a war council. She keeps going. The northern villages have maintained independent winter reserves for generations. They don't draw from central supply. You're not protecting anything by evacuating them. You're cutting your own forward intelligence. She pauses. Her eyes move to the maps. Those mountain passes, the 3 that matter for spring approach, the fastest guides who know them are in those villages. Not your military records, not your scouts. The people who have been running those passes since before this castle existed. She gestures at the map like she's been in this room before, like it belongs to her already. If you give those elevation points to raiders in winter, she continues, they will use them as high ground in spring. You won't know until they're already positioned. And by then, the distance between their advantage and your disadvantage is too far to close quickly. Dead silence. My senior commander, Aldrich, is staring at the table with the careful expression of a man who is having a feeling he hasn't authorized and is working very hard to contain it. My 2 Eastern generals are glancing at each other with the subtle body language of people who have just been shown a flaw they missed. Casson opens his mouth. She speaks because I allow it, I say. My voice comes out quiet. It always does when I mean it most. I hear it land in the room the way a stone lands in deep water. Not loud, just final. I am looking at her when I say it. She meets my eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looks back at the maps. She makes 3 more points. Every one of them is correct. The third one identifies a supply chain vulnerability my generals built their entire Eastern defense model around, and the silence after that particular point has a different quality. The silence of professionals recalibrating in real time. When she finishes, Casson says something measured and political about the value of diverse perspectives in strategic planning. He is a man who has mastered the art of retreating without appearing to move. I let him. The council concludes. The room empties. I fall in beside her in the corridor without announcing it. She doesn't startle. She knew I was there before I spoke, which tells me everything about the quality of her attention. "Careful, little wolf," I say. She doesn't break stride. "I'm not yours." I hear that land in my chest somewhere my ribs were supposed to protect. 3 words. Said cleanly. No anger, no provocation. Just a statement of fact, delivered by a woman who has been someone's property for 22 years and has just finished deciding, very permanently, that that era is over. I don't answer immediately. We walk 6 steps in silence before I say, "I heard you." She doesn't respond to that. She doesn't need to. She turns at the corridor junction and disappears toward the east wing, and I stand at the corner for a moment and listen to her footsteps fade. And I have a very honest conversation with myself about what just happened in that council chamber. My wolf has been unsettled since the courtyard. That's the right word. Unsettled. Not agitated, not aggressive. Unsettled the way a compass gets near something magnetic, that restless, constant pull toward a single direction, regardless of how much you try to point it elsewhere. I have been fighting it for 4 days. I am starting to understand I am losing. I turn and walk back toward my study. Aldrich falls into step beside me with the border report under his arm, because Aldrich is the most patient man I employ. "She's right about the passes," he says. I know. Casson's going to file a formal objection about her presence in council. He's welcome to. Aldrich is quiet for 3 steps. Then, "My lord, your wolf." "Don't. I'm not trying to." "Aldrich." He stops talking. Good, because I know what he was going to say. My wolf has been broadcasting since she arrived in a way I cannot contain and have largely stopped trying to. Every wolf in this castle can feel it. The territorial shift, the possessive edge, the way my attention tracks her without my full permission. It's the most embarrassing thing that has happened to me in my adult life, and I am handling it with the only strategy available to me right now, which is refusing to discuss it. I get back to my study. I sit at my desk. I look at the map of the northern passes. I think about the way she said, "I heard you," like it was a courtesy and not a concession. Like hearing someone was the baseline of decency, and she had lived so far below baseline for so long that she handed it out carefully now. Rationed, never assumed. I stare at the map for a long time. Then I call for Aldrich, and we revise the Northern defense strategy along the exact lines she recommended. I tell myself it's because she was right about the passes. That is partly true. The part of me that is entirely honest with itself knows that I would have revised it regardless, just to have a reason to tell her that I listened. That night, across one wall of stone, I hear her moving around her room. I hear her pull back the curtains. I hear her settle in the chair by the window. Not the bed, the chair, which means she is still watching, still observing, still taking inventory of every single thing around her because she has not yet learned, in her bones, that she doesn't have to do that anymore. I could tell her, I don't. Because a woman who has survived on vigilance for 22 years doesn't stop because someone tells her to. She stops when the evidence accumulates to the point where the vigilance is no longer necessary. So I will be the evidence. I will be consistent and patient and present, and I will keep being those things until she stops watching the door at night. I turn over in my bed. My wolf is quiet for the first time since we arrived in Ashcroft. Not satisfied, not settled, just listening. Same direction as me. 3 hours later, the border rider arrives with news that changes everything about the next morning, and I lie in the dark with the report in my hand and the smell of her through the wall and the specific dread of a man who has just realized his enemies have noticed something he has not yet fully admitted to himself. They've been watching the castle, and they've been watching her. I come back wrong, and I know it before the horse stops. The wound is lower on my left side than I told Aldrich, deeper than I let the field medic assess, because the field medic would have grounded me from the return ride, and I needed to get back. That was the decision. I made it on the border road, with blood soaking through my shirt in the dark, and I would make it again, and I am currently standing in my own corridor at 2 a.m, trying to convince my legs that the floor is level. It is level. My legs are the problem. Aldrich is talking. I can hear the shape of the words. Raid, northeast perimeter, 3 down, 2 critical. And I am tracking the information, but I am tracking it from slightly further away than normal because the edges of my vision are doing something I prefer they not do, which is softening. My lord, Aldrich's hand on my shoulder. You need the physician. I need Aldrich. Not my voice. Both of us turn. Serafina is standing in the corridor. She has on a dark robe over what is clearly a sleep shift. She threw it on fast, came out fast, moving with the alert decisiveness of someone who heard the yard and was already building the picture before she opened the door. Her hair is down. Her feet are bare on the cold stone. Her eyes move from my face to my left side to the dark stain at my ribs in about 1 second flat. And the calculation she runs in that second is so fast and so thorough that it rearranges itself on her face as action before she has spoken a single word. Come inside, she says. Not to Aldrich, to me. Aldrich looks at me. I look at her. She has already turned and gone back into my chambers. I follow her. I don't make a decision about it. My body just follows her the way water follows ground, without consultation, without debate, along the path that requires the least resistance, and arrives at the only destination that makes sense. Inside my chambers, the fire is still going. She must have heard the outer gate and started preparing before she even opened her door, because there is already a lamp lit on the side table, and she is pulling back the chair to the working height of the bed and locating the medical kit from the cabinet in the corner with the directness of someone who mapped this room before tonight. Sit, she says. I sit. She moves in front of me, and her hands go to the lacings of my armor chest piece, and she starts working them without ceremony, without hesitation, her focus absolute, and her face doing what her face does, going very still, very clear, the external noise of the situation stripped away until there is only the thing directly in front of her. Her fingers are warm. I become aware of this in a way that is deeply inconvenient, given the present circumstances. How deep? She asks. Long, I say. Not deep. She gets the chest piece off, sets it on the floor without looking at where it lands. Her hands go to the hem of my shirt, and she stops. She looks at my face. I look back at her. There is a question in that pause that neither of us is going to name out loud. She is asking permission. I, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, the man who has not asked permission for anything since he was 24 years old, give a single short nod. She pulls the shirt up and off. I watch her face when she sees the wound. She doesn't react. That composure she has. She runs it like an operating system, constant, underneath everything, holds completely. Her jaw does not shift. Her eyes do not go wide. She assesses, and then she gets to work. The cut runs from the bottom of my ribs, across the left side of my torso, 7 inches, the kind of clean line a good blade makes when someone knows what they are doing, and almost achieves what they were trying to do. Almost. She cleans it with a cloth dipped in the kit's antiseptic. Her hands are steady. Not delicately steady. Strongly steady, the steadiness of hands that have had to be steady under pressure before and learned it through practice rather than temperament. I watch her work. The lamplight and the firelight layer over each other and make everything in the room the same amber gold color, and her hair falls over one shoulder as she bends close, and I am aware, acutely, separately from the pain, running alongside it like a parallel current, of how close her face is to mine, right now. The distance is clinical, professional, entirely appropriate to the situation. My wolf does not find it clinical. My wolf finds it the single most significant proximity it has experienced in 31 years of living, and is conducting itself accordingly by going completely, uncharacteristically silent. Not in the tense way it goes silent before a fight. In the way it goes silent when something important is happening that it needs to be present for. I focus on the ceiling. This is a tactical decision. You rode back like this, she says. Not a question. Yes. 4 hours. Yes. A pause. Her hands keep moving. That was not a smart choice, she says. I know. You're an alpha king. You have people for this? I needed to get back. She stops. I feel her stop. The hands go still, just for a second. And then she says, very carefully, very quietly, why? I do not answer that. The real answer is 2 syllables, and I am not prepared to hand it to her in a lit room at 2 a.m. while she is stitching my ribs. She goes back to work. She doesn't push. She pulls the needle through the first stitch, and I feel the specific sensation of a wound being closed. Not painless, but clean. And she works in silence, and the fire burns, and the castle breathes around us. She is almost done when it happens. My hand moves. I raise it toward her, toward the side of her face, toward the lamplight catching the edge of her cheekbone. And I catch it. I stop it. I place my palm flat on the mattress beside her knee, and I breathe through my nose once, hard, and I look at the wall. She sees it. I know she sees it. I know because her hands still for exactly half a second before she ties the final stitch, and the sound she makes, a single controlled exhale, tells me she has registered what almost happened and chosen, deliberately, to keep moving. She ties the last stitch, sits back, the clinical distance returns. Appropriate, correct. She collects the medical kit and stands, and for a moment, we are just 2 people in a firelit room at 2 a.m. with the storm outside and everything that just happened, and didn't happen, sitting between us like a third presence. Don't do it again, she says. I look at her. The ride, she clarifies. I'll try. The corner of her mouth moves. Just barely. She picks up the kit. She walks to the door. She stops with her hand on the handle, the same way I hear her stop at her own door sometimes, and she doesn't turn around. Kyle, she says. I go still, because that's my name. My name. Not my title, not my rank. Just my name, in her voice, in the quiet, and something about the combination rearranges every defense I have spent a decade carefully constructing. You're going to have to start being honest, she says. About why you do things. Eventually. She opens the door, She goes out. I sit on the edge of my bed in the quiet for a long time. My ribs pull. The stitches hold. The fire burns low. I have led armies. I have ended wars. I have walked into rooms where everyone in them wanted me dead, and walked back out again without breaking stride. And a 22-year-old woman with bare feet and borrowed stitching thread just looked me in the face and told me to stop lying to myself. And she wasn't wrong. That is the part that makes it so bad. She wasn't wrong. I lean back against the headboard in the dark and press my palm flat over the closed wound, her work, her hands, her steadiness. And I look at the ceiling and I admit something to myself that I have been refusing to admit since the moment she stood in that courtyard in the snow and looked at me like I was mildly inconvenient. I did not want to get back to the castle tonight. I wanted to get back to her and the men who have been watching this castle, the men whose writer I received this morning. They have been watching her specifically. They know she is here. They know she matters. They know that the Alpha King, who has never had a weakness, has just, publicly, catastrophically, developed one. The question I cannot answer tonight, the one that sits in the dark, like a lit fuse while my stitches hold and the fire dies down and she sleeps one wall away, is whether I found out in time or whether they are already moving. Chapter 6. The great hall was on fire, with light and noise and bodies, and Seraphina stood at the edge of all of it like a woman, deciding whether the ocean was safe to enter. She had not been told there would be a festival. She had walked down from the east wing, following the sound of music through 3 corridors, deep, string-driven, old, and opened a door and walked into the full, roaring heart of a midwinter celebration. Wolves everywhere, tables loaded until the wood groaned, fires in every hearth, children running between the legs of warriors who were currently losing arm wrestling contests and laughing about it. The smell of pine resin and roasted meat and spiced wine so thick it was almost a physical thing you had to move through. She had stopped in the doorway for 3 full seconds. Then she walked in. Nobody in the castle had formally welcomed her. Nobody had offered to explain what she was, or where she fit, or what the protocol was for a woman who arrived in chains 6 days ago, and now occupied the most private wing of the Alpha King's fortress. The wolves watched her with the careful, calibrating attention of a pack reading something new. Not hostile, not warm, just watching. She found a place near the far wall and procured a cup of warm cider from a passing tray and stood with her back to the stone, watching in return. Kyle was across the great hall. He stood with his senior commanders in a loose cluster near the north fireplace, tall, dark, wearing something slightly less armored than usual, which on him still looked like a man who was 3 seconds from being in a fight. He was in conversation. He was also, with a consistency that a person would need to be actively trying not to notice in order to miss, tracking her location across the room every 40 to 60 seconds. She had counted 4 times before she stopped counting because it was not doing anything useful for her. A warrior materialized beside her. Enormous, broad-shouldered, slightly pink from the mead, wearing the expression of a man whose filter had gone off duty 2 cups ago. He introduced himself as Bren and told her, with the cheerful directness of the professionally drunk, that 42 members of the Blackthorn Pack had a standing wager on how long before the Alpha King formally claimed her, and that as of tonight, the closest guess was the next full moon. "That's absurd," Seraphina said. 41 other people disagree with you. He doesn't want to claim anyone. He wants to manage a political situation. Bren looked at her with the patient expression of a very large man who is about to explain something obvious. "My lady," he said carefully, I have served under Alpha King Draveth for 6 years. I have watched him walk through burning buildings, negotiate with warlords, and ride into battle on a broken shoulder. I have never once, in 6 years, seen him look at anything the way he looks at you. He paused. He looked at you 4 times in the last 3 minutes. 5, Serafina said, before she could stop herself. Bren grinned so wide it nearly left his face. She turned away from him. Across the hall, a slow piece of music started. Something low and old, and the kind of melody that made you feel like you were remembering something rather than hearing it. The crowd shifted. Couples moved together. The floor opened up in the middle of the great hall, stone worn smooth by generations of the same music, the same feet, the same winter ritual. Kyle was moving through the crowd. Not fast. Never fast. He moved like everything in his path would resolve itself before he needed to ask it to, which it always did. He came through the crowd the way a current comes through water, and he arrived in front of her with the quiet certainty of a man who made decisions completely before he acted on them. He didn't say anything. He extended his hand. Serafina looked at it, at him, at the hand again. She took it. They moved to the floor, and he placed one hand at her back and held her other hand with a care that was almost absurd from a man his size. The specific, careful grip of someone who was very aware of the difference between how strong he was and how strong he was choosing to be. He kept her angled toward the center of the room, away from the edges where the crowd was thickest. Not possessively, protectively. The distinction was a thin line, and she was aware of exactly where it was drawn. They didn't speak. The music was too old and too present for the kind of words that would fit the moment. What was present instead was simpler and worse. The warmth of his hand through the fabric at her back, the steadiness of his hold, the way he matched her pace without leading it. She had been held roughly her whole life, held like an inconvenience, like an instrument, like something someone was moving from one location to another. This was the first time in her memory that someone held her like she was worth being careful with. She hated that it mattered so much. She hated that tears existed somewhere behind her eyes right now, and she was spending considerable energy making sure they stayed there. The music shifted. He turned with her. The firelight moved across his face, and for one unguarded second, she saw it. What he looked like without the Alpha King on top. Just a man, looking at her, without calculation, without armor, without the careful management of expression. He ran constantly in public. Just looking. Then the song ended, and someone called his name from the commander's table, and the Alpha King was back. The walls were back. The management was back. He released her hand, stepped back. His eyes held hers for exactly 1 second longer than anything required. Then he walked away. Serafina stood on the dance floor in the warm noise of the celebration, and the realization arrived so quietly it was almost gentle. She trusted him. Not with everything, not yet, but with this, with the careful grip and the angled protection and the way he listened and the way he never once made her feel like something to be managed. With this, she trusted him. That was the most dangerous thing she had discovered since arriving at Castle Blackthorn. And somewhere near the commander's table, a warrior named Bren collected a significant amount of silver from a man who had bet on the full moon and reminded everyone that proximity was not the same thing as time. He was not wrong. The letter arrived at breakfast. It came with the morning dispatch, sealed with the Archive House emblem, addressed to the Alpha King in his official capacity, sitting in the pile between a border survey and a supply manifest like it was ordinary. Kyle read the first page. He turned it face down on the table so fast that the cup near his hand rattled. Serafina looked up from across the table. He looked at her directly. His face was arranged in the specific neutral expression she had learned to read as the one that preceded something significant. "After breakfast," he said, "come find me." She came. He was in the map room, the large one off the war corridor, with the long oak table and the territorial maps pinned flat and the narrow windows that let in winter light in pale, thin strips. No council members, no guards inside the door. When she entered, he was standing at the table with the archive documents spread open and his hands braced flat against the wood and his head down, and he looked like a man who had been standing there long enough to need the table's support. He straightened when she came in. He told her. He told her in the direct, unflinching way. He did everything. No softening, no careful preparation. Just the facts in order, precisely delivered, with his eyes on her face the entire time, because he was that kind of man. He did not look away from what he was doing to her. Her father's name was Aldrich Embervale. Royal Wolfblood, one of 4 hereditary alpha lines in the Northern Territories, the kind of bloodline that carried authority through either parent, the kind that made a child a political target from the moment of birth. He had been murdered when Serafina was 3 years old. The murder had been documented as illness. His estate had been seized. His daughter had been placed in the Morel household through forged adoption papers that classified her as a foundling with no traceable origin. Helena Morel had signed those papers. Helena Morel had known every single day of the 22 years that followed. The silence in the map room after Kyle finished was the heaviest kind. Not empty. Loaded, wall to wall, with the specific weight of a truth that had been compressed underground for 2 decades and was now occupying its full size. Serafina stood at the other side of the table. Her hands were flat against the wood, mirroring him, he noted, though she didn't know it, and her face had done the thing it did when something enormous arrived. It went very still. Not blank, still. Like water going glass smooth right before something large moves under it. She was processing. He let her. He had learned in 9 days that she required no prompting to think and no rescue from her own mind. She went into it and she came back out, and she was always more accurate after than before. He had never met another mind that worked the way hers did, and he was not going to interrupt it. After a long time, she said very quietly, "She called me disposable." He felt that sentence in his back teeth. "Standing in your courtyard," Serafina continued, her voice level, remote, the clinical distance of someone conducting an autopsy. She used that specific word. While she had the documents that proved I came from a line older than her family name, sitting in a locked drawer somewhere in that estate. She stopped. Her jaw tightened once. Her eyes went bright. Not with tears, he had come to understand, but with the particular intensity of a feeling that had been compacted for so long that its natural size, when it expanded, had nowhere to go except upward behind the eyes. She pressed her fingers hard into the table edge. He moved around the table. He didn't touch her. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth off him in the cold room, close enough that the presence of him was a physical fact she could locate without looking. And he stayed there. That was all. He had nothing to offer that words could carry. What he had was presence and patience and the absolute refusal to go anywhere, and he gave all 3 of it without ceremony. She turned slightly toward him. Just slightly. He stayed. After another long silence, she said, "Why are you telling me this in here? Alone? Because it's yours, he said. It belonged to you before it became a political document. You get to decide what it does next. She looked at him. He watched it move through her, that statement, landing in a life where nothing had ever been decided by her, where everything had been decided around her, over her, in spite of her. He watched it move through her and settle and change something. You never had to earn your right to exist, he said. You had it from the beginning. They just hid it. Something cracked, not loudly, not visibly. The way something cracks deep in good wood, internal, structural, a fissure running through the thing that had been holding too much pressure for too long. She breathed through her nose once, twice. Her chin stayed up, her spine stayed straight. She did not cry, but she turned toward him fully. And he put his arm around her, one arm carefully the way you put a wall between something valuable and the wind. And he held her. Not romantically, not possessively. The way you hold someone when they have just found out that everything they endured was built on a lie, and the grief of that is too large for a person to stand alone inside of. She let him. Outside the map room windows, the winter light moved. Inside, two people stood at a table covered in documents that were about to change everything, and for a few minutes, neither of them moved. What neither of them knew yet was that the archive letter had already been seen by eyes it was never meant to reach, intercepted at the Eastern Relay Station, copied and sent to the one man in the Northern Territories who understood exactly what Serafina's bloodline meant for Kael's rule, and what it meant for anyone who wanted to end it. Lord Fethian made his mistake in front of 200 wolves and did not understand for approximately 4 seconds what he had done. He was standing near the center of the formal reception hall, which was full, which was important, which meant every political figure currently residing in or visiting Castle Blackthorn was present. And he was looking at Serafina with the particular assessment of a man who had spent 3 decades deciding the worth of things he had no right to evaluate. He said it loud enough to carry. That part was deliberate. So this is the girl from the chains. I assumed Morel disposed of her because she'd outlived her use. I'm surprised she's as presentable as she is. One expects less from the disposable ones. The reception hall inhaled and held it. Serafina went very still. Kael was 10 feet away. He turned from his conversation with the calm of a man setting down something fragile, which was the most terrifying kind of calm anyone in that hall had ever witnessed. He handed his wineglass to the nearest person without looking at who caught it. He walked toward Lord Fethian. The 4 seconds it took to cross that distance were the longest 4 seconds most people in the room would remember. Because nothing violent happened during them, and yet every wolf instinct in the room fired simultaneously. The deep, body-level signal that registers the difference between a man walking toward you and a predator moving with full intent. Fethian's smile began to fail at approximately the 3rd second. Kael stopped 18 inches from him. "Say it again," Kael said. His voice was quiet. That was the part. Not loud, not theatrical. The voice of a man who had already made a decision and was offering one courtesy before he acted on it. "I want to be certain you understand what you're doing before you finish doing it." Fethian tried to recover. "My lord, I meant no disrespect to your household." "You spoke about her," Kael said, "in my hall, in front of my pack, using a word that Helena Morel used. That word will not be used again, not here, not in any territory that reports to me." A pause. "Serafina Vale is under my personal protection, not the castle's protection. Mine. If that isn't a clear enough distinction, I'll spend the rest of this evening explaining it to you at length, somewhere private." The silence after that was absolute. Phaethian chose wisely. He bowed. He removed himself from the hall within the following 20 minutes, and from the castle within the hour. Nobody in the room spoke about it directly, but the message that moved through the assembled wolves was not subtle and was not slow. The Alpha King was in love, not infatuated, not entertained, not politically interested. Catastrophically, completely, publicly in love, the kind that made an alpha break a man's wrist in a courtyard and keep a woman's chambers next to his own and throw a lord out of his hall for one wrong word. The kind that changed everything. Seraphina found him afterward on the eastern battlements. He was standing at the stone wall, looking out at the dark tree line below, the cold working into his jacket because he had come out without his cloak, the line of his jaw still carrying the hardness from the hall. She walked up beside him. Close, not touching. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes," he said. "I did." She looked at the side of his face. "You nearly had him removed by force." "I showed remarkable restraint." She looked at him. He turned and looked at her. And for one moment, one long, fully present, entirely honest moment, neither of them performed anything. They were just two people, standing on a dark battlement in the cold, with the trees below and the sky above, and everything that had been building for 10 days sitting between them like something that had finally reached the edge of the container it had been kept in. Her hand was resting on the stone wall. His hand was resting 2 inches from hers.